This lecture is in preparation for students to understand and discuss the text by Christopher Columbus, which is the letter of discovery, the letter that he wrote to Ferdinand and Isabella, the King and Queen of Spain. So in this lecture, I'll talk about the historical context of Christopher Columbus, also some about his ideology, things he expresses in the letter itself. Columbus, of course, is the leading figure in the era known as the Voyages of Discovery. But this era does not exist in a vacuum. We need to understand kind of the broader narrative of the Voyages of Discovery, the sorts of things that Europe was doing at the time, and why Columbus, this will help us understand why Columbus approached this new world that he discovered, which he, of course, didn't think was a new world at all, but why he approached it the way that he did. Really, what we're talking about here, and I realize that students often grow up, hearing this kind of grand narrative about Columbus. I know that's been problematized in recent years, but Columbus is seen as the great forerunner of this country. We have, of course, many cities and places named after Christopher Columbus, the District of Columbia being one of the key examples of that. Also, a lot of cities named Columbia, Columbia, Missouri, Columbia, South Carolina, and so forth, right? Columbus, really, we must place him in the context of the late Middle Ages, when Europe was going through a number of crises. One of the key points that needs to be brought out, because it's Columbus himself brings this up in his letter, is what we might call the problems of the Crusades. The Crusades were a sequence of events starting in the late 11th century, really through about the end of the 13th century, where Western Europeans, Latin-speaking Christians, under the, or rather at the behest of the Pope, under the direction of various kings, nobles, even on a couple of occasions the Pope himself, went to the Eastern Mediterranean, to the place Christians call the Holy Land, what would commonly be known today as Palestine or Israel, and tried to reconquer that territory, or rather conquer it outright. Muslim rulers had governed over that territory since the late 7th century, but of course this land had a lot of resonance for Christians. And this was initially successful largely because the Muslims were in disarray. The First Crusade managed to wrest a lot of territory away from the Muslims, including the city of Jerusalem. But the Muslims regrouped and gradually took back that land piece by piece. In 1291, the last Crusader stronghold, Acre, was taken by the Muslim forces. And Crusaders, such as they were at the time, were expelled from that country and left either to build fortifications on roads in Cyprus and other places in the Eastern Mediterranean, or simply to desire to go back to the Holy Land. 200 years after this, Columbus writes a letter to Ferdinand and Isabella talking about the desire that they have to go on crusade again, and so this desire never died. Now, this was problematic in other ways for Europe. By gaining that land, the Europeans had come into contact with the economically prosperous areas, and with goods, especially luxury goods like spices and silks and things like that, Chinese porcelain, other things that Western Europeans developed a taste for, and access to those Crusader states gave them the ability to obtain those goods and to sell them in Europe. Well, once the Crusader states were no longer in the hands of Western Europeans, this caused a problem. The Silk Road, this overland trading route from the Mediterranean through the Middle East and over to South Asia, to the Indian subcontinent, and from there really to points beyond, to Southeast Asia, where a lot of spices were obtained, even overland over the Himalayas to China, where porcelain and silk and other things were in great abundance and high quality. This was something that Europeans found, well, of course, very lucrative, those who could tap into this. Travelers like Marco Polo wrote famous accounts of traveling on the Silk Road that were widely read and widely discussed in Europe. But the failure of the Crusades shut Europe out of the Silk Road trade. Not entirely, but it forced them to deal with middlemen in the Middle East, especially Muslim middlemen, who many of them were considered enemies to the Christians, and that meant that the goods that they could obtain were bought at a much higher price than if they had direct access to the Silk Road. Now, leave that aside for a second, and I want to talk a little bit about the geographic knowledge of the late Middle Ages, or the people of the late Middle Ages. The map, and it is a map, the image, I should say, that you see on the screen here is what is known as the TO map. And you can see the T and the O there. Well, this was a nice and convenient way that people in the Middle Ages organized the world. And some of this goes back to ancient geographic texts like the Almagest of Ptolemy, or even some of the writings of Aristotle. But in the Middle Ages, Europeans divided up the world into three basic parts, or three basic land masses. You can see that Asia is at the top there because most maps in the Middle Ages would have oriented themselves by putting East, or Oriens in Latin, on the top. Europe is down at the bottom left, and Africa is at the bottom right. You can see from the Latin there under the names of the continents that these correspond with ideas or persons from the book of Genesis, the three sons of Noah, Shem under Asia there, or Sem, Japheth or Japheth under Europa, and then Ham or Ham under Africa. And so this is, of course, tied into the biblical narrative as well. You can see there that the Mediterranean is the sea that divides Europe and Africa. And then the other one in the middle there says Mare Magnum Fine, the end of the Great Sea. In other words, actually no, that's Mare Magnum Sive. These letters in Gothic script tend to look a lot like each other. Or the Great Sea or the Mediterranean is what that says. And this divided things neatly. Now, of course, right in the center of that is the city of Jerusalem. It's not actually shown on this particular rendering of the map, but that's what they consider to be the center of the world, or in some ways the center of the universe. This is the place, of course, where Jesus lived, and so the place where God became man, heaven and earth touched each other, and so it was fitting for them to put that in the center. Now there was as well a kind of apocalyptic element to this geographic knowledge. They thought that Asia held back these hordes of people who would be unleashed on the earth toward the end of the world, the great tribes of Gog and Magog, who would attack the true believers in Christ. And anyway, we don't need to go necessarily into all of the details about that. But this is the kind of geographic knowledge that existed at the time. This nice, neat, almost mathematical division. Oh, the other part of this that is of note is the circle, or the O, that surrounds all of the landmass there, of course, is, well, in Latin it says Mare Oceanum, or the ocean sea, the ocean water. And so this is a nice, neat, way of encapsulating all of the earth. We can see similar depictions, in Dante's Divine Comedy and other texts from this period. The other thing that we should note about the late medieval geographic knowledge is they thought that people who lived outside of, well, the lands that they knew, the further into Asia one went in particular, or into Africa, these lands that were distant, They thought that beings existed there. In some cases they call them humans or people. But some beings existed there who were very different from these Europeans. Now, I will come back to these in a moment here. I want to show you another image here. This is from a text published in Germany in, I think, 1493, so exactly around the time Columbus was making his first voyage to the Americas. But it's a what is known as a bestiary, or a kind of catalog of different creatures. And these are illustrations of the kinds of beings that Europeans thought existed in these distant lands. And some of this is drawn from ancient texts. You can see there in the upper left-hand corner here, where I have the cursor, or the arrow, that we have the Cyclops, right? And so some of this was known from texts like the Odyssey. But there were other, beings they thought existed in these distant lands, like people with, anthropods with no heads, but with their faces on their torso. Human-like creatures with gigantic ears over here, or gigantic mouths. I'm not sure how practical that would be for anything, but some of this may have come from, travelers who went to distant places, and perhaps into Africa, and saw the different kinds of decoration that people use to make themselves appeal to other people, and come back, and this may have grown in the telling of it. One of my favorite ones down here is what is known as the ceopod, or a one-footed person, gigantic foot, you can see there. This has been borrowed in a number of texts in popular literature. You may recognize it from C.S. Lewis's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. What are the names of those creatures in that story? Anyway, that escapes me right now, but those are taken from these. Lewis was a professor of medieval literature, and these are taken from these medieval texts. Also, these kind of goat-looking creatures, or these are also borrowed, of course, by Lewis in his Chronicles of Narnia. The Dufflepuds, that's what they're called. Sorry for my brain lapse there. Now, and so, Europeans who thought about traveling to these distant lands fully expected to find these, what they called monstrous races, these creatures who existed outside. And so we see some of that, of course, in Columbus's letter. Now, back to this narrative of the European desire to have contact with markets, with goods in Asia. The Portuguese prince called Henry the Navigator, he actually never became king of Portugal, but he's a tremendously important figure in European history, and in American history too, I suppose. In the 15th century, Henry the Navigator set up a school in Lisbon, or I can't remember exactly where it was in Portugal, to train seafarers in the latest techniques of sailing, to use the latest technology, things like astrolabes and star charts, and other, the magnetic compass actually was brought into being around this time. And all of this was put into use in the training of these seafarers, with the goal of finding a sea route to Asia, of tapping into the markets at the origin points of the Silk Road, so that they didn't have to deal with the markups and the middlemen and everything that came from the long voyage on the Silk Road. The Portuguese were not just interested in Asia, though. They were also interested in Africa. And over the course of the 15th century, they began to make voyages around Africa. And as they did so, they came into contact with peoples of Africa, and also with goods, particularly gold and slaves. These were the main commodities they were interested in. Gold probably primary over slaves. And there were huge gold deposits in Africa, and Europeans knew this, because of interaction they had had with Africans previously. But this is the beginning, of course, of the transatlantic slave trade as well. The Portuguese realized they could obtain human cargo, and although that was just a trickle at this point, most of those poor Africans going to Europe and working as slaves for European masters. Once the New World was put into full operation, especially with the rise of sugar plantations and coffee plantations in the New World, then slaves began to be shipped in huge numbers there. So Henry the Navigator was an important figure in this whole saga. His school produced a number of breakthroughs, and the Portuguese-funded sailors made longer and longer voyages around Africa. Famously, in 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope, saw open ocean before him, and recognized that he had found the way around Africa and the ocean route to Asia. He returned to Portugal with this great news, and the Portuguese certainly had a leg up on reaching Asia. Well, Columbus, of course, had a different idea about what needed to happen, so I'll come back to that in a moment here. But let's talk about a couple of other developments that are of importance here. In the late 15th century, Spain, which had been up to this point a collection of smaller kingdoms. In fact, Portugal, the country of Portugal, is one of those surviving kingdoms. During the Middle Ages, as Spain was reconquered from the Muslims who had governed over it for several centuries, as Christian kings retook the Iberian Peninsula, they divided it up into a number of kingdoms. Now, prominent among those kingdoms were the Kingdom of Castile in the central part of Spain, and the Kingdom of Aragon in the northeastern part of Spain. And in the 15th century, these two kingdoms united with each other through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the Ferdinand was the, I need to get this right, I may have this wrong, the King of Castile, and Isabella was the heiress of the Kingdom of Aragon, and this brought these two together in a marriage and united Spain. And this gave the Spanish kings, Spanish monarchy, a great deal of power, which they then put to the task, partly to the task of trying to reach Asia. And they were behind the Portuguese, but they were willing to look at options to try to achieve that goal. In the middle of the 15th century, 1453 to be exact, the Byzantine Empire, which is the heir of the old Roman Empire. This empire had been around since the 5th century, so nearly 1,000 years. They had acted for a millennium or for not for a millennium, but for about 700-800 years at this point, as a kind of bulwark against the expansion of Islam into Europe. Constantinople in the Middle Ages was the greatest city in the Christian world. The Byzantines had really occupied a prime position in the Eastern Mediterranean. Well, Constantinople fell in 1453 to Muslim forces led by Turkish peoples, and their general was named Mehmet II. The fall of Constantinople and the subsequent expansion of the Ottoman Turks, or the Ottoman Empire, into the Balkan Peninsula further compromised the ability of the Western Europeans to access the all-important markets of the Eastern Mediterranean that tied them into the Silk Road. Those who had a kind of prime position in that trade were the Italian cities, particularly in this era, Florence and Genoa. Venice had a prime position in earlier centuries, but they had not fallen on hard times, but Florence and Genoa in particular were expanding their reach at this point, and partly through the production of high-quality wool cloth, which they could then trade with these Muslim middlemen for the goods of the Silk Road, for silk and for porcelain and for spices and things like that. And so these Italian cities, these Italian merchants had a leg up on the Eastern Mediterranean. Well, other kingdoms like Portugal and Spain were in a vulnerable position. They had to deal with the Italians, which is another set of middlemen who tended to mark up the prices to especially high levels. And so the Portuguese, had achieved gains by making these incursions into Africa and obtaining gold and slaves and other things that they could then trade. The Spanish wanted to, of course, find some way to insert themselves into the economic conversation. Now, at exactly the same time as Columbus was obtaining funding from Ferdinand and Isabella and making his voyages, the Spanish expelled the last of the Muslims, the last of the Muslim rulers from Spain. In fact, in the year 1492, the final Muslim stronghold of Granada was defeated by the forces of Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, they didn't just drive the Muslims out, they also forced the Jews, who lived in Spain in fairly large communities in the Middle Ages, to either convert to Christianity or to get out of Spain. Many Jews fled Spain, some of them eventually going to the New World, some of them going to the Netherlands or Germany or other places. But many Jews did convert, either under duress or out of self-interest. Some Jews continued to practice their religion in secret, and this led Ferdinand and Isabella to establish a branch of the Inquisition, which was a kind of investigative body of the church, a branch of the Inquisition specifically to root out those, as they were called, conversos or moranos, those converted Muslims and Jews who were held up under suspicion for continuing to practice their religion or to hold beliefs that were heretical within Christianity. Now, I only point this out because we have to understand the full mindset here of Ferdinand and Isabella. To understand why they would fund Columbus, to understand the kinds of promises that Columbus makes to them upon finding this land that he thought he had discovered. In reading the letter, we can begin to make sense of some of those things that he says. Now, Columbus himself should be well known to everyone. Born in 1451, died in 1506, made 4 voyages to the New World. He went to his deathbed, it seems, believing that he had not discovered a new world, but that he had found a sea route to Asia. Columbus was firmly convinced that that is exactly what he had done. Now, this is what was known as the Western Passage, the theory of the Western Passage. It was beginning in the 19th century, largely through the work of Washington Irving, the famous American author. It came to be believed that people in the time of Columbus thought that the Earth was flat. Well, those who were educated, even marginally educated, would have been acquainted with the theories and proofs and texts from the ancient world that not only proposed but even proved that the Earth was spherical, that it was round. In the 3rd century BCE, for instance, Eratosthenes, working in the Museum of Alexandria or the Library of Alexandria, did an experiment that showed curvature of the Earth and even came up with an estimation of the circumference of the Earth that is really quite close. It's only a few hundred miles off of what it actually is. So remarkable achievements in the ancient world. Well, Columbus and others who were educated would have known this, and so it only makes sense that if you sail west out into the ocean that you're going to reach Asia, right? Well, of course they didn't know that there was a huge landmass in the way, and a vast ocean. They don't seem to have absorbed Eratosthenes' theory about the size of the Earth, or maybe they just conveniently ignored that. Columbus was not the only one who proposed this. We can see that there's a whole bevy of people who were gunning for this. Columbus was simply won the race to be the first European, of course, to do this. As you look at the letter, it's important to be aware of, to pinpoint many of the Eurocentric assumptions that Columbus took with him on this discovery, right? At the beginning of the letter, he, for instance, talks about the people that he encountered in the New World, saying, for instance, that they have no government of any importance. Well, there was certainly a government. It just wasn't something that Columbus, as a European accustomed to certain structures of government, would have been acquainted with. He criticizes them for not having private property. Well, that's a conception that Europeans held, and we're going to talk about this later in the course as we discuss John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and some of the other authors. But this was not necessarily something that a concept that didn't necessarily exist in other parts of the world. He says also, nowhere in these islands have I known the inhabitants to have a religion. Well, they almost certainly had a religion. It just wasn't anything that would have been recognizable to a European like Christopher Columbus. And so he carries those with him, right? If we expect him to be this cosmopolitan, modern man, we're going to go wrong. Columbus was a 15th century, really a medieval man with a medieval understanding of things, and so it's important to acknowledge that. Well, again, the economic goals come up repeatedly in this letter. Columbus talks about the desire that Ferdinand and Isabella have to tap into the gold trade. Well, this would have come via the competition with the Portuguese, who were obtaining vast amounts of gold from Africa at this point and had promise of further riches. He also, he talks about spices and other things. He is a little shocked, though, that he doesn't find cities, because he thought that if he has discovered Asia, having read the accounts of Marco Polo and John Mandeville and other travelers from Europe who actually may or may not have gone to Asia, but who wrote accounts of journeys to Asia, describing vast cities, he's kind of distraught, maybe, shocked that he hasn't found any vast cities, but he sort of leaves out the possibility that, well, maybe they just exist in the interior of the land, and we haven't had a chance to explore that yet. And so he's appealing to Ferdinand and Isabella, really for more money, because he says this is in your interest, your self-interest, to fund these expeditions so that you can gain all of this wealth and catch up to the Portuguese and the Italians economically. Some rather puzzling things here, at least for students not acquainted with this context. He says to Ferdinand and Isabella in the letter, I will be able to pay your highnesses for 5,000 cavalry and 50,000 foot soldiers for the war and conquest of Jerusalem. Well, let's remember that the Crusades were still a goal, still an ideal held up by these great monarchs, especially Christian monarchs, overtly Christian monarchs like Ferdinand and Isabella, who had a lot of investment in the Christian cause. And so, producing all of this wealth so that we can buy soldiers, we can pay soldiers, and then you can go and, take the Holy Land back. Columbus knows exactly the right buttons to push here to get more funding out of Ferdinand and Isabella. Columbus himself is also seeking what may be called privilege, that he expects, demands, at least requests, that Ferdinand and Isabella help him out with some of the things that he holds dear. And so he asks, for instance, that they, given the great thing that he has done for them, that they appeal to the Pope and obtain a cardinalate, a position of a cardinal for his son. That is a high position in the church. And he says, I know he's not really qualified and he's too young, but the son of the Medicis of Florence, one of these great merchant families in Florence, became a cardinal at a similar age with similar qualifications. So surely this can be done for my family as well. And this taps us into the way that society functioned in the late Middle Ages. That people, sought sponsorship and privilege from those who held power. Columbus is participating in this thing. Lastly, this puzzling comment in the very last paragraph of the letter. In fact, there are a series of puzzling comments here. We have these kind of Amazon women, as it were. We have these men of the island of Caribe, as he calls it, and who were fearsome creatures, really kind of savages. And then we also have this one island called Faba, where everyone is born with a tail, another place where all the people are bald. Well, these comments come out of this geographic knowledge context that we talked about, where Europeans believed that in the distant parts of the earth that people had different physical characteristics. And so, did Columbus really see somebody with a tail? Almost certainly not. He may have seen something that looked like a tail. Maybe it was part of their the way that they dressed or something like that, but his mind seems to have automatically gone to all of these ideas about the monstrous races of these distant lands. What did Columbus think that he had found? Well, I think if you had to press Columbus on this in 1492 or 1493 as he was thinking about this, he probably would have thought he made it to what the Europeans called Chipangu, or Japan, which was believed and actually quite accurately to be the easternmost of these islands of Asia, or these lands of Asia. So he thought he'd made it to Japan. Didn't realize that there was this vast continent or two continents in the way, and that sailing to Asia would take a much more arduous, a much more difficult, much longer journey. That, of course, was done by Magellan about 3 decades later. Okay, so that's the historical context and some of the ideology behind Christopher Columbus.